I should introduce myself. My name's Andrew Newman. I'm one of the research and policy managers at SQA, and I have a role working on grading in NextGen. And what we're aiming to do today with this last kind of update around grading for the year is to give some information about where we're at with grading in NextGen. If I could have the next slide, please. So I want to share a little bit of the journey we've been on with grading, partly because we're hoping to have a wider group of people on this webinar. There may be some aspects of the webinar that people have seen before, but we're very keen to keep pushing the message to those who haven't had the benefit of that information before. But also because we want to share how we have gone through the process of setting the sort of design principles of NextGen HN, and coming to some of the conclusions that we've come to around grading and some of the important aspects of grading that we want to build into the qualifications. And I think at this stage we have quite a good idea of what those should be, but we're not at the end of the piloting process yet. So we're going to aim to be as transparent as possible, share as much information as possible, but we do welcome questions, welcome feedback, and the pilot process is still going on. So go to the next slide. So I'll start with the journey so far, and if we move straight on to the next slide. So SQA initiated a review of the existing or current HNC and HND qualifications back in 2018. I think those qualifications had been around certainly well before my time at SQA. I joined back in January this year. They've been around for 20 odd years, and I think the perception was that they needed a review and update to ensure that they were appropriate for the next 20 years. So quite a significant update and change. And to talk through some of the kind of change drivers for that review on the next slide, thank you. Some of these are, I suppose, the kind of normal, standard or typical change drivers one might expect in any qualification review, but I think there are a few things to pick out in particular. For example, the digital revolution, which is already overtaking the kind of initial stages of this review with respect to things like AI, for example, but also more long-term things to think about, like changing demands for learners, career paths looking different these days versus 20, 30 years ago, people not perhaps expecting to work in the same career for their whole life, having to be prepared for jobs that they may not know about when they're going through their education process. And building capacity around mental health and resilience was a big aspect of that. So in terms of some of the early engagement findings, just with respect to assessment and grading, there was a highlight around the heavy assessment load in the current qualifications, the perception that the nature of the assessment was repetitious, and that perhaps differentiation of candidate performance was particularly important. And I suppose that may have been because there was a perception that in some cases differentiation of candidate performance wasn't happening as well as it should be, or that the existing grade outcomes weren't truly reflecting the standard of learners on those qualifications. So that led to an initial position with respect to the review activity. Different options were looked at, views were taken across a range of stakeholders. It was recognised that differentiation in some form was preferred, and that there were potential advantages to that. So, for example, student motivation with respect to the qualifications, supporting progression into jobs, or articulation into university, and identification of higher performing candidates. So that led to a conclusion that there should be a preference for full qualification grading, and that grading should, in the sense that it's full qualification grading, take into account all of the components, or as much as possible the components of the qualification. And an initial set of design principles were set out for NextGen. And I won't go through all of these, but they were a mix of, in some cases, quite specific things. So, for example, the HNCs and the HNDs were going forward going to be designed to be separate individual qualifications of a certain size and level, and so on and so forth. But also that the design principles should somehow address those concerns about the assessment load, that they should incorporate things like learning for sustainability and meta skills. And I think, incorporate would mean a number of things, whether that's just in the content or, whether it's broader than that. They should have new grading models. So the grading model would not be there. There would be new grading models, and those new grading models would be reflected in new grade outcomes of achieved with merit, and achieved with distinction. And that's obviously a significant change from the current ABC grade outcomes. The purpose of the qualifications remains the same. They're still there to cover the broad industry areas that they're covering and to support progression into work or articulation into HE. And I think it's really important to recognise that hasn't changed. But coming back to the grading approach, I think it's worth talking a little bit about the thinking behind grading and why we grade qualifications, because these are some of the kind of context, the basic principles that we're looking at when we're thinking about how we work with these qualifications. So why do we grade qualifications? Well, I suppose the most obvious thing to say is that they should be a measure of a learner's achievement against a set of qualification content. They can be an indicator of future performance, whether that's to an HEI or to an employer or to the person taking the qualification. They could be a form of feedback, so they could provide motivation, they could drive good achievement in a cohort of learners on a particular qualification. But those benefits will usually only come where a grade truly and meaningfully reflects the qualification's content and purpose, and where it's seen to do so. It has sort of validity or face validity from the point of view of people on the qualification, people teaching the qualification, and so on. It's also worth reflecting that there are slightly different approaches across academic and vocational qualifications. And I'll go through this in really broad terms and very much recognizing that there is endless nuance sitting underneath this. But I think it's reasonable to say in broad terms that you might typically expect an academic qualification to have letter grades, for example, A, B, C, versus a vocational qualification having more descriptive grades, so pass, merit, distinction. Academic qualifications will tend to measure on a relative scale, who are the best performing candidates, who are the less well performing candidates in a particular cohort. Whereas a vocational qualification will normally have a concept of a true pass grade, a level a candidate needs to demonstrate to be of a particular competence against the set of content. And I suppose the reason that exists is because vocational qualifications reflect real world occupational activities. So that standard can be set. We look at the next slide, please, Jordan. If we look at the HNs, the challenge there is that we need a grading system and grade outcomes that can do both things. A learner might come onto a NextGen HN qualification, or in future what we might just be calling the HN qualifications, and be looking to progress into the workplace, thinking about their job that they're going to do after their course, or they might be thinking about HEI courses. And of course, the balance of those two things will vary depending on the qualifications, but we're looking to have a coherent set of design principles that will go across the suite of the qualifications, because credibility will come from that, but still support those two progression routes. So the NextGen qualifications have those three grades: achieved with merit, and achieved with distinction, and those grades have been given descriptors. And one of the first conclusions we've come to over the past months of evaluation work is that we can improve on the descriptors for these HN grades. So we'll still have achieved with merit, and achieved with distinction. But what we want to do is ensure that those grades reflect the separation of the two qualifications, the HNC and the HND, which after all are at different SCQF levels, level 7 and level 8. So an achieved within a level 7 should mean something slightly different from achieved within a level 8. We also think that the descriptors themselves are really important, and they should support the progression and articulation piece. They should be useful information for HEIs, employers, also learners, parents, and so on, to understand what the grades mean and essentially embed the understanding of the grades as these new qualifications roll out. And for that reason, in part, we'll have those grade descriptors on the NextGen HN certificate. This is an example certificate, of course, not a real learner, but you'll see, you don't need to read the text here, but you'll see that the certificate will be a normal certificate, but with that grade descriptor on it. So it will be there for transparency as a matter of record. And I think it's really important that those descriptors reflect the true achievement within the qualification. So bringing to a summary on the current versus next-gen qualifications. Current qualifications will typically have one graded unit. In some cases, there'll be 2 graded units that a learner will do to achieve the qualification overall. The next-gen qualifications will have full qualification grading. The current HNC, HND qualifications have that ABC grade scale, ABC grade outcomes that a learner can achieve. The new qualifications will have achieved with merit, and achieved with distinction grade scales. The current qualifications don't have meta skills and learning for sustainability specifically built into the content of the qualification, but that is the case with the next-gen qualifications. And a couple of areas where the approach has not changed. The existing qualifications and the new qualifications both use internal assessment, so assessment that is devised by centres to allow centres to take an approach that they feel is appropriate to assess the content. And they also retain the same purpose. So there's no change in purpose. They're still HNCs, HNDs. They're still supporting the progression routes that the current qualifications support. So I'll move on now to talk a little bit about how we've gone about evaluating the delivery of these qualifications through the pilot. And I'll start just by talking a little bit around the purpose of the pilot. So the pilot has been a genuine pilot in the sense that we have truly looked to test the approaches that we've taken, but have made changes as we've gone along the way. One of the reasons for piloting is that we can only come to good evidence-based conclusions by building evidence through the experience of the pilot. But when that evidence points to something that needs to be changed, of course, we've had to think carefully about whether we change that in year or at the end of the year. And we have made changes as we've gone through the piloting process. And I think we will continue to do that, although the position, at least with respect to grading, is becoming much clearer as we've gone through that first full year of piloting. It's still vital that we fully test those models and ensure that what we roll out works for everyone and is the appropriate approach. The piloting has been a collaborative approach. It's following a service design-led model, so it should be an activity that is collaborative with our from SQA point of view end users. We're only one part of the education system, so there are a set of key stakeholders involved, whether that's the centres themselves doing the delivery, obviously the learners on the qualification, but also sort of end user stakeholders like employers and HEIs who want to understand what those grades mean and will be taking those learners on after the qualifications. The development of the qualifications happened through qualification design teams that typically involved pilot centres within that process, as well as input from employers and so forth in terms of the content. We also have an external reference steering group that has a representative group of stakeholders that can inform, test what we're doing and challenge us on the approaches and the design principles that we're coming up with. In terms of pilot centres that we've been working with, there are 14 pilot centres in total who've contributed towards the delivery. in 22 and in session 22, 23 and session 23 and 24. I won't read through all of those, but you can see a list of those pilot centres. And I think it's absolutely fantastic to have that involvement in a piloting activity and development of qualifications like this. The piloting has also been taking place across a really wide range of qualifications. So different qualification areas with different content and different needs and challenges within that content from the point of view of how the qualifications work. Just reflecting on where we're at in terms of the pilot delivery. So obviously we're currently at the relatively near the start of session 23-24. This chart reflects the delivery of the actual qualification. So of course, you know, in prior years there has been work on the, you know, the review, the evaluation, the design principles, and then the content of the qualifications. But in terms of actually delivering the qualifications, with the exception of HNC television that was an early starter in 21-22, a good chunk of the qualifications were delivered last year in 2022-23. And that gave an enormous amount of information and evaluative activity to draw on when we are testing the conclusions, testing the design principles, and checking how the grading models in particular are working. As we move into 23-24, I'll stay on that previous slide. The qualifications that were delivered in 22-23 are being delivered usually in their second year. And they, for the most part, are HNC qualifications, so SEQF Level 7 HNC qualifications. As we move into 23-24, we've started the delivery of HND qualifications, so Level 8 SEQF HND qualifications. And although there is an awful lot in common between the HNC qualifications and the HND qualifications, and they share the same set of design principles, it has illuminated some differences and some challenges that I think we want to take into account for the purposes of the qualification. So an awful lot of information from that year. I think we can draw really good conclusions from that with respect to grading, but we're still testing in this session the grading models. So coming on to the grading models, I won't go through all of our grading models in too much detail. Many people in this call may have seen them before, but I will talk around them a little bit and try and share a little bit of specific information in terms of how they work. I hope that will be more useful. When we started, there were 3 grading models being tested: our key competency model, our holistic model, and the key component model. And we've already come to a conclusion that we are no longer going to use the key component model. I talked earlier about how the assessment is centre devised. Centres can set their own assessment for these qualifications. Obviously, that comes with challenges because it's a challenging piece of work to do, especially at the start of a new qualification. But it does allow centres to produce something that suits them, that is appropriate potentially to their local industry needs, whilst at the same time assessing the content and allowing a grade to be judged for that learner. Our key component model, it was only delivered in one of our industry areas, did specify a particular form of assessment, a portfolio, and for that reason it seemed to not work well for that particular qualification area, and for that reason we're not going to be using that model anymore. The remaining 2 models, the key competency model and the holistic model, have an awful lot in common. And from a kind of more objective point of view, I would say that they are more or less the same approach in terms of grading. And for that reason, we've been able to build our set of principles around those 2 models. One thing I think it is worth saying is that the 2 models are so alike that we can use them to build the principles, and we're not going to come to the end of a piloting period and somehow try to reverse engineer qualifications of a particular model into another model. That won't be needed. We've been able to refine and develop as we've gone through. So just looking at what we can say about the grading models in general terms on the next slide. They are slightly different approaches to whole qualification grading, but they are essentially different versions of the same model from a QA point of view. So each of them has units, each of them has evidence requirements that sit under those units. For a learner to be considered for a grade, they would need to achieve all of the evidence requirements in all of the units that they need to meet the rules of combination for the qualification, which in some sense by definition means that they're an achieved grade already. Each of those qualifications, each of those models is a version of whole qualification grading. They are assessing a learner across the content. It's not always 100% of the content. So for example, in some cases where we have some optionality built into the qualifications, it might be 70 or 80% of the qualification, but it will always be enough of the meaningful content of the qualification that it can be said to be whole qualification grading. Each of them produces a final outcome of achieved with merit, or achieved with distinction. So they share those grade outcomes, and the descriptors will be common across them. Each one is internally assessed. As I say, we've removed that key component model because it specified a particular form of assessment. So we've now got the flexibility within the remaining approaches. And each one uses what we've called grading matrices. They probably exist in many versions in other qualifications and have different names, but we call them grading matrices that are used to support centres to make judgments around the grade. And I want to talk through just a little bit what those grading matrices look like. So I put this slide up really just for transparency. I'm not going to read through it or asking anyone on the webinar today to be able to read the small text on this slide. It's really just to give a sense of what a grading matrix will look like and what they do look like in some of the pilot qualifications. This is the first page of a grading matrix. Typically these grading matrices will be 10 pages long, something like that, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, depending on the qualification. And they have kind of three key sections that I want to draw out. So the first one there is the criteria itself. So down the left-hand side is a list of criteria, and those criteria are not units, they're not unit titles, they're not outcomes. They are an additional layer of description of what the qualification should mean and be. They are criteria that we expect a learner to be judged against for the qualification outcome as a whole, so that we can measure a learner's whole qualification grade. So they're set up front, they're set by the qualification development teams, and they should not change through the life of the qualification. So there'll typically be 8, 10, 12 criteria across the grading matrix, depending on the nature of the qualification. Next to that criteria, we have the descriptors themselves. So you may be able to see at the top here that these are headed achieved, achieved with merit, and achieved with distinction. Now these are subjective written descriptors of what we would expect a learner's performance in that criteria to look like if they were of an achieved standard, an achieved with merit standard, or an achieved with distinction standard. It's important to say that a learner will not receive a grade of achieved for a particular criteria. There is only one grade outcome, and that is for the qualification as a whole. These descriptors are looking to say, for this particular criteria, the learner was of this standard. And that could be through a whole range of assessment throughout the course. And that's why the final sort of key section to draw out here is a guidance section, which will sit under each of the criteria, and it will allow us to draw a centre's attention to the types of assessment evidence we would expect them to be looking at when they're making a judgment for a particular criteria. It can also allow us to put in information around the type of content within the qualification. So if there are particular units or particular outcomes within particular units that are more relevant to this criteria than others, we can draw attention to that. A couple of things to say about this section. It will always be guidance. So when we're doing whole qualification grading like this, we want to take into account that flexibility around the assessment. We know the evidence requirements have to be met, but the type of assessment could vary across centres, but it should still be judged in the same way for the particular criteria. And also, although we might specify particular bits of the qualification in terms of content that we feel are relevant for a criteria, it may be that in the professional judgment of a centre making this grade judgment, that there are other areas that are relevant too, and there is no reason to rule those out. They should be taken into account in terms of the grading judgment. So that's to give a very brief run through of the grading matrix. And I'll move on now just to talk about some of the evaluative activity that has in part led to those grading matrices and also shored up some of the other approaches we want to take, and I'll try and give a bit of information about those as well. So a large majority of the evaluative work that we have done on the pilot has been in the form of grading reviews, which are effectively recorded discussions, not recorded like we're recording this webinar, but written down discussions with our pilot centres about the delivery that's taken place on the qualification. These have been incredibly useful and I think truly reflect the service design-led approach. We've carried out these grading reviews for all of the qualifications that delivered last year. One of the challenges around that is that when you're looking at grading, although grading may take place in some sense throughout the year, pilot centres typically monitor performance of candidates throughout the year. Assessments take place at different times in the year, not just at the end. The final conclusion and discussion around final grades doesn't happen until the end of delivery. So our grading reviews have looked to reflect on that delivery and that activity. They've almost all been face-to-face. We've been able to do that this year, which I think has been incredibly useful. We've sat with our pilot centres, usually 2 or 3 pilot centres with representatives who have been doing the delivery on the qualifications, and we have talked through how their delivery has worked. So we've asked them how they've set the assessment on the qualification, how they've linked that assessment to the content and the evidence requirements in the units. We've asked them how they've gone about discussing the grading decisions and how they reached the grading decisions, how they reviewed student evidence, how they recorded that discussion, how they standardized that internally, who they had involved, how many people, and so on and so forth. And that's been incredibly useful. Because we've treated those discussions as reflective activities in the context of a pilot with no judgment, no sense that anyone could do anything wrong. It's been incredibly useful to understand how that experience has worked, and I think has drawn, a few conclusions from the point of view of the grading approach. One is that the approach has worked well for that group of pilot centres. I mean, there have been challenges, but for the large part, it's worked incredibly well. But it's also, in particular, shown us that standardization has been really important within those discussions and has started to happen naturally within those grading review discussions, even though we haven't planned that. So if I move on to the next slide. As I say, clear engagement and positivity from pilot centres. In particular, meta skills has been a feature of the assessment. Obviously, it's in the content, but it's also been a feature of the assessment and in some sense has aligned to the grading decisions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of this presentation. Learners have been more engaged from the start. Where they understand that all of the assessment that they're doing may contribute towards the final grade. There's a natural sense of engagement that comes from that. But also, generally speaking, centres have wanted more exemplification to reassure them that their assessments are appropriate. And also they wanted more confidence that they are grading fairly. The natural question to ask is, I believe this is the right grade, but how do I know another centre isn't being, more lenient or more strict? I want to make sure that I'm doing that in the right way. Centres are not the only groups that we've sought to engage with. I mean, they may very well be the most relevant in terms of the mechanics and the working of our grading models, but HEI and employers are absolutely vital in terms of the understanding of our grade outcomes, what they mean, and to support learners' progression after the qualification. All of the qualifications have had a real depth of employer engagement in terms of the qualification development process. The design teams have had employer representation, but also through the pilot delivery activity, we've had an assessment and an articulation, progression and grading advisory group consisting of external representatives of employers and HEIs who have been able to guide us, challenge us. We've made ourselves accountable to that group as we've gone through and shared information as we've developed the approach. It's also allowed us to do a bit of additional HEI engagement through contacts. So we've been able to benefit from that. If I move to the next slide. So we've met with University Scotland. We've met with a whole range of universities. I won't read them out. And we are planning further engagement with universities. So at the end of that, we will have met with all universities within Scotland. We've also attended conferences, so the HELOA conference, the SCUP conference, and the discussion at almost all of those sessions has been around two key areas. Number one, the grading outcomes, the achieved with merit, achieved with distinction, what they mean, and number two, how we can support HEIs in terms of getting to grips with the new qualifications, how we can smoothly get them into the new system. Just to draw some themes out of those engagements activity. HEIs generally speak, these are all in general from the discussions that we've had. HEIs have been really positive about the updated approach. They think that the use of whole qualification grading is a bit more rigorous, and they see that as a good thing. They've certainly wanted more understanding about the purpose of the new grade outcomes when they're already working with A, B, and C. So, I think there's a benefit to us improving the descriptors and the guidance that sits around those outcomes. They had noted that there might be a perception of lack of academic skills against those grade outcomes. As I say, these qualifications need to support both progression into work, but also articulation into HEIs, and achieved with merit, achieved with distinction might be naturally perceived to be more of a vocational grade scale. So I think, that is something we need to work around with those descriptors. They felt that differences in grade outcome descriptors might be subjective, which is always a challenge with this type of grading and something that we can look to mitigate, but I don't think it makes the approach, any less valid. Prompted the question, what is the assessment? What sits behind these qualifications? And then, you can see that over time, this information will need to become clearer as the qualifications embed. They felt that our achieved grades were quite a high bar and that the distinction was a very high bar, at least in terms of the descriptors. And I think there is something to be said for the value of the achieved grade, in particular against the current A, B, C grade outcomes. So if you think about how the grade outcomes are calculated, a C grade in a current qualification would require a learner to sit one graded unit assessment, whatever that may be. The achieved grade in the new qualifications will require a learner to achieve across all of the units, all of the evidence requirements before they can be considered for grading. So I think there is something to be said about, what's the difference between those two things and how do we move forward with the new grades and ensure that there's really good understanding of them. A couple of final bits from HEIs more on the kind of, I suppose, pragmatic side. To support articulation, they were very clear that the content of the qualifications is vital, and we've done a lot of work to make sure that content is shared across the system. They highlighted the challenge of dealing with a dual economy system, and i.e. that there are still learners going through the current versions of the qualifications. And I think the project team is certainly very sensitive and aware of that, and that there'll be work to do to roll out the other qualifications. They also pointed out that there'd be specifics for certain qualifications. So, reflecting the fact that there's more information that will need to come out as the qualifications roll out. We've also done quite extensive learner engagement, and that's been done around the qualifications as a whole. And I think it's a challenge to understand how we can take on board learner engagement activity, typically focus groups, discussions, interviews with learners on the qualifications. How do we take that evidence, real wealth of evidence about the learner experience, and apply them to what we're doing in grading? It may not seem fair to ask a learner how they think a qualification should be graded. I think my response to that, if I was a learner, was to say, well, I'd expect the awarding board, the SQA, to know how that should happen. But learners do have relevant experiences. They're at the heart of the qualifications. They're the reason for the qualifications existing. So I think it points to things around, more information within the documentation, improving the way that supporting centres to be able to share more information about the qualifications. So I'll come on now to talk about direction of travel and try and sum up a little bit of where we think things are heading. Before I go through a final couple of specific things in terms of next steps and things that we're doing. So it's been really clear from the grading reviews and the activity across such a range of qualifications and different industry areas that the flexibility, in particular in those two grading models, the key competency model and the holistic model, has allowed the grading to work well for those different qualifications. Quite a diverse range. Accounting should not be the same as social services. HNC TV should not be the same as HNC computing. It should feel different and the assessments will look different. And therefore, a grading model that allows for those assessments to be truly valid to those areas and really leverages the expertise of the centres that are delivering those qualifications will be supportive of the overall principles of these qualifications. And for that reason, we don't think that we will have a specific, inverted commas, grading model that all NextGen HNs use. Rather, we will have a set of principles that define what the approach to grading will be. Now, those principles might say that there should be a grading matrix, and currently that's what the principles will say. There will be a grading matrix which will have appropriately written and well thought out criteria, that those criteria will cover the breadth of the content, that grading judgments should be made across those criteria using suitable descriptors that have suitable guidance and link to the types of assessment and the content and so forth. So in some sense that will describe what the model looks like, but it will still allow the flexibility of assessment that will sit under that model. We've also come to a conclusion on meta skills. I'll come on to that in a later slide, but we do think that learners' engagement in meta skills can be part of the grading approach for these qualifications, and that will truly see through the original design principles of the qualifications. We know that QA and standardization is vital, and again I'll talk a little bit more detail about that in just a second. We have more engagement to do with employers and HEIs, especially around those overall grade descriptors. We're in the process of improving those overall grade descriptors and having a version for both the HNC and the HND. But it's one thing to write those internally, taking into account things like good practice, but we also need to validate those with employers and HEIs who will be the end users of those grade descriptors, and that's something we're seeking to do in the very near future. In addition, there is a significant piece of research, desk-based research going on. I'll talk in a little bit more detail about that. And we're looking to have all of these things in place in a kind of near final version for early next year, which will give us a really good opportunity to have feedback, stakeholder challenge around those principles and make sure that we're not missing something and we have got the appropriate approach in place. I'll come on now just to a couple of specific things, firstly around grading and meta skills. So we come to a conclusion around meta skills, that meta skills can be part of the grading models for these qualifications, but only insofar as we can grade the extent and depth of a learner's engagement with meta skills, their reflective activity. What we don't think meta skills should be graded on is meta skills in and of themselves. So, for example, we don't think the qualification should be trying to grade a learner's integrity or feeling. Those are a couple of example meta skills. However, where a learner is thinking about those meta skills in the context of their delivery, where that's closely aligned to the grading matrix, where it's a key part of the qualification design principles, we think that can have a contribution towards the grade. It's not a large or significant contribution, but it does have some contribution to the grade, and we think that will be important to ensure it's really delivered in an effective way. This is an approach that we've been talking to our pilot centres about fairly recently, and with almost no exceptions, our pilot centres are very much on board with that approach. Where we have one area where pilot centres don't see that is a good thing to do, and we're working through that with those pilot centres to understand if we've got the approach right and whether it's something specific about that area. So that's part of that evaluation process. The way we're going to do that is that we've written clear grade descriptors for our meta skills. This is on the next slide, thank you. So it will look like a criteria within a grading matrix. It will have descriptors across achieved with merit, achieved with distinction. It will have clear guidance around, what we're looking to grade, that it's not the meta skills per se. And we think this will slot and in fact already is slotting very conveniently and naturally into the existing grading approach that pilot centres are using. From my point of view, having worked in vocational qualifications for quite a long time in different parts of the UK, meta skills or something like meta skills has always sat around these types of qualifications, but to have it truly contributing even in a small way towards the final grade, I think is a true reflection of the original design principles of these qualifications, but also something of an innovation. So one to be supported and rolled out carefully. Next, I'll just say something about standardization. So, as I said, in those grading review meetings, we have spent, it's occurred not by plan, it's occurred naturally as we've spoken with pilot centres. We've spent quite a bit of time talking about the way grades have been decided and how judgments have been made and capturing information about that. And standardization may, as a matter of principle, be very important, but we can see that evidence through our grading review activities. So we've identified that as a key requirement of the qualifications, identified that in a sort of interim report produced earlier this year. And we're currently in the process of collaborating with internal teams at SQA in terms of how we might do that type of standardization. This is an example where you have to take the in principle position and flesh it out from an operational point of view to ensure that it will work properly. And that's not just internally, but it's also with the centres as well. Initial discussion around that is that it can be supportive, it can be sensitive to pressures that centres will be under, that it will need to manage resource requirements in SQA, but it's clear from the evaluation activity that centres want that confidence around the reliability of the grades. The current approach is still there, so the QA is continuous. It's members of SQA EQA team go out and speak to the centres about the evidence requirements, how the learners are meeting those evidence requirements. The new approach would be that plus standardization activity on top. So it should be very robust, but it will be an additional step, and that's something we need to work out carefully because it will have a cost in terms of time and effort. And then the final specific thing I talked about is a piece of desk-based research activity. We are very concerned that we don't just focus on the, as it were, nuts and bolts delivery of the pilot centres within the pilot qualifications. We also want to take a wider view across other types of qualifications. Number one, to show that some of the approaches we're taking are not unprecedented. There isn't really anything new in education, but also where we might be taking slightly different approaches from other similar qualifications. Have we really accounted for that, and why we're taking a different approach? So we're going to be looking at a range of qualifications. We're going to be looking at, of course, HNCs and HNDs in Scotland. We know them well, but we want to account for, where we've made the differences. And there are a range of assessment approaches in the current HNCs and HNDs. There are also HNDs in other nations within the UK other than Scotland, so we want to take a look at those as direct equivalents. There are relatively new qualifications in England called HTQs, Higher Technical Qualifications, that have a similar purpose to the HNCs and HNDs. They're very much more, tend to be very much more employer-led and closely aligned to apprenticeship standards, but they're an interesting example to compare against. We're also looking at T levels in England, relatively new qualifications. They're actually at level 3 in England, so equivalent of level 6 in Scotland. So they're, in theory, school-age qualifications, although tend to be delivered in FE in England. But they have a similar purpose. They are vocational qualifications that want to prepare learners for both going into HEI and going into employment, and have a grade associated with them. And then finally, we want to take a broader view across vocational qualifications, generally speaking, in countries in Europe at SCQF equivalent levels 7 and 8. So to try and throw a wide enough net to get useful information about those types of qualifications. And we're able to do that because we have the advantage of having a research team at SQA who can support with that. It's a significant piece of work, but it will bring a bit of robustness and credibility behind some of the decision making. So I think that's everything I want to cover in terms of sort of information sharing and what we're doing. Obviously, we're coming into the second year, well into the second year of the pilot delivery, and there is still more work to do. In particular, interaction with operational teams here at SQA. We need to be really clear about the principles we're setting, what they look like in terms of delivery, and that they will work and they'll meet requirements around things like reliable grades and standardization and so on. We've also got ongoing engagement with pilot centres. The discussion with MetaSkills is part of that. We've spoken to each and every pilot centre in detail about how we're doing MetaSkills, and we want to continue to test that still works and works well. And there's also that piece around engagement with HEIs and employers that's really important too. So that's the end of my slides. I just want to make a point of saying a big thank you to everyone who's dialed in and for listening to those slides.